clearly the Scandinavian countries, as other countries, are struggling to get out of the crisis. But I think if you look at Denmark and Sweden, in many respects, the fundamentals are not that bad compared to other countries. We are, in a sense, front runners in terms of reforms, not only of the labor market, but also in terms of preparing for an aging population and so on. So if you look at the public finances, both Sweden and Denmark are among the countries in the world who have public finances sort of basically under control, not only as it looks today, but also if you look forward, taking into account the demographic changes. So in that respect, I think the situation is sort of robust. Of course, there are challenges, getting out of the crisis, productivity growth and so on, so it's not just fantastic, but I think a fairly good situation.
There has been some speculations, let's say, by namely Paul Krugman, Nobel laureate, and also one of the best performing hedge funds of the last year, All Krieg, that there will be a debt crisis in Denmark, something along the lines of what the European periphery experienced. Different reasons, but a similar scenario. How likely is that, or more generally, what do you think about this claim, this assumption?
I think it's basically a misreading of the Danish situation, and the comparison to southern European countries is not a very clear comparison. It is true that if you look at gross numbers, Danish households have high debt, also high debt relative to income, but they also have a lot of assets. So in net terms, they are not indebted. Possibly the easiest way of explaining this is that if you look at Denmark as an entity, we have been running a current account surplus for a number of years. We don't have a foreign debt, we have a foreign asset position, and it's of course increasing since we have surpluses. So that's a clear sign that there's not a savings deficit in Denmark. Of course, if you dig into it, there's a distributional profile on the debt, but actually most of the high debt households are also households with very high income. There's a tail, of course, of households or persons having a problematic debt level, but not at a scale which would be destabilizing. You should also take into account that even despite the financial crisis and a huge decline in housing prices, household debt has not really been an issue, not a spike in private bankruptcies or anything like that. So I don't see that as a major problem.
Paul Krugman, one more time, at the end of April, in an interview, who said that he expects Sweden to experience something similar to Japanese lost decade, maybe 2 decades now, meaning that Sweden is fighting or is going to fight deflation, and he or the Swedes are going to lose. How likely is that? Is it a real threat?
Of course, many countries have a problem in getting out of the crisis, and that also applies to Sweden. And whereas in sort of the immediate aftermath of the crisis, Sweden was performing relatively well, growth rates have been coming down recently. So of course there is an issue. But comparing to Japan and a lost decade or 2 lost decades, I think I see many differences. First, these problems in Japan was preceded by a boom and very severe problems in the financial sector, which you do not see in Sweden. Also, there's a dramatic difference in public finances. Sweden has very sound public finances, have made a major pension reform in the 90s, which implies that if you look at sort of measures on fiscal sustainability and so on, the conclusion is that fiscal policy is sustainable in Sweden, despite a fairly generous welfare state compared to most other countries. Sweden has recently made a number of reforms of the labor market and the tax system and so on. So I think there's a lot of also ongoing change, the structural changes in Sweden, which goes in the direction of improving the growth potential in a medium-term perspective.
So let me turn the tables, if you will. What would you say is the biggest threat or the biggest problem now for Scandinavia or particular Scandinavian countries at the moment?
One problem is the productivity growth. both Denmark and Sweden have had declining productivity growth, sort of structurally cleaning out for business cycle effects and so on. So there's been a declining trend that's also been seen for other countries, but very visible for Sweden and in particular for Denmark. So that's of course a reason for concern if the underlying productivity growth would be systematically lower than in other countries, OECD countries and so on. That would imply that the gap or the difference in production income levels and so on would increase. It's something which is much discussed, but that's of course one. In Sweden there's of course an issue whether the property market, house prices would need to adjust. We have had an adjustment in Denmark, but there's not been an adjustment in Sweden, and the same applies to Norway. So clearly there are some question marks or reason for concern, but I think the scale of this is still within what can be coped with, also in terms of economic policy.
So is Scandinavia, from investors' perspective, or Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, still a safe harbor, something that investors can use to dodge the bullet, if you will, of the current or maybe next financial or generally economic crisis?
It's always extremely difficult and dangerous to predict something to be a safe haven. I think the Scandinavian countries have shown themselves to be rather robust in the sense of being able to manage, but that does not imply that they have been crisis-free. We have seen very deep crises also in the Nordic countries. Sweden is a particular case in point because they had a very deep crisis in the 90s, actually preceded by a boom and problems in the financial sector. So one could say that they had their own financial crisis in the early 90s. Which resulted in huge dramatic deficits of public finances and so on. So a deep crisis, but also an episode which showed an ability to politically act upon this, a very steep change, a turnaround in economic policy to cope with the problem. So that I think is something characterizing the Scandinavian countries, that they can end up in crisis as everybody can, but the ability to act politically, the political capital, if you want, to react to is rather strong.
Last question, Torben, from investors' perspective then, how to play Scandinavia, or how do you bet on the Scandinavian robustness, as you said?
I think the Scandinavian countries have shown to be resilient or robust in that sense. But of course, with a lot of volatility in the short run, I also think it's important to point out the differences, for instance, in monetary regime. Finland is a member of the EMU. Sweden has opted out having a floating exchange rate. Denmark has opted out having a fixed exchange rate. So in that respect, they're very different. And of course, the short run adjustments in exchange rates, in interest rates and so on can differ dramatically between the countries because the regimes are so different. So that implies that there can be significant short-run volatility in financial variables, asset prices and so on. But if you look at the sort of real economy and the medium-term prospects, I think they look reasonably good for the Scandinavian countries in a comparative perspective.
Skandinávie je z pohledu investora stále tím bezpečným přístavem, anebo přinejmenším patří mezi bezpečnější přístavy, říká v rozhovoru pro investiční web Torben Andersen, profesor dánské univerzity z Aarhusu a člen několika poradenských orgánů finské, švédské a dánské vlády.